Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Anya Prusa, the Slater Family Fellow and Senior Associate at the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you today, exactly 1 week before President Joe Biden opens the Leaders Climate Summit on April 22nd, Earth Day. Brazil has been invited to participate, and in recent months, the US Special Envoy for Climate Change, John Kerry, has been in talks with Brazil's Minister of the Environment, Ricardo Salles, in the hopes of driving more ambitious emissions targets and a reduction of deforestation in the Amazon. The conservation of the forest is essential to Brazil's international climate commitments, yet deforestation has increased significantly in the last couple years, hitting a 12-year high in 2020. Dry season forest fires in the Amazon basin have raised alarm around the world. Yet analysts are increasingly concerned that national level conversations are not moving fast enough. Instead, many are calling for the greater involvement of state and local governments, civil society organizations, and local stakeholders in Brazil, including indigenous communities, to craft the strategy for sustainable development in the region. The question of the Amazon is inherently both global and local. There are over 25 million Brazilians living in the Amazon, from large cities to small villages, connected only by boat. The Amazon is a wealth of biodiversity, but its residents are some of the poorest in Brazil. The COVID-19 pandemic has only made these challenges more stark, as the region's health core resources are stretched to the breaking point. Indigenous communities, already threatened by illegal deforestation and land grabbing, have been particularly hard hit. So what are the pathways forward for sustainable development in the Amazon? Today, it is our privilege to welcome speakers who are directly involved in this effort and working to drive change and innovation when it comes to sustainable, equitable development in the Amazon basin. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Tatiana Schor, the Executive Secretary of Science, Technology, and Innovation from the state of Amazonas, and Secretary Mauro de Almeida, the State Secretary of Environment and Sustainability from the state of Pará. Dr. Ilo Terena, Legal Counsel for the Articulation of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, is unfortunately unable to join us at this moment. I would also like to thank our co-sponsor, the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center. This event was organized as part of our ongoing partnership with Uma Concertação pela Amazônia, for a standing Brazil-US dialogue on sustainability and climate change. You can find more information on our website, wilsoncenter.org/Brazil. After the initial presentations, we are going to take questions from you, our audience. You can submit those via Twitter at BrazilInst or send us an email to brazil@wilsoncenter.org. And just a heads up that this conversation will be mostly in English, but we will have some Portuguese as well. Thank you to both of our panelists. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Tatiana Schor to go first.
Well, hello to everybody in the panel. Hi, Mauro and Anya. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a very special moment where we can talk about strategies and the way we're going to think about policies of sustainable development in the Amazon. So what I brought today for the discussion is a bit, how do we build public policies? Because when we're on the other side of the table, you're always like, you hear people saying like policies, 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 and you're always thinking, well, you know, it's easy to say, it's very difficult to do, and it's very difficult to be coherent in the policies you make. So as Anya introduced me, I am today the Executive Secretary of State for Science, Technology, and Innovation in the Secretary of Economic Development, Science, Technology, and Innovation. I'm originally from the Federal University of Amazonas in Manaus, so I am based in the Amazon. I talk to all of you today from a small city in the Amazon called Novairão. So much of what I'm going to say is related to what really happens here. And that's important, because sometimes we have some very good ideas, but when you come to the floor, it's not really what will glue, as we say in Portuguese, right? Vai colar. So we do need to, and that's very interesting, at least in my perspective, before we start building public policies on sustainable development, we have to build a narrative. And this narrative has to have principles. So in Amazonas state, in the Amazonas government, we started in 2019 thinking about how could we build a narrative on economic development, a greener economic development, in which we could reach minimum consensus. We know not everyone's gonna be in the same way, is gonna talk in the same language, or is gonna have the same objectives, but it's very important that we can build a perspective where everybody agrees. And it's very important that we are able to attract to this discussion different actors, because the Amazon is the complexity. I usually like to think a bit on the economic complexity of the forest, and it's not that simple. So when we started talking about that in the government, we decided, now we talk that we have at least some basic principles to start with, and which is very important. When we're thinking about the forest and the Amazon, we do believe the Amazon is important for humanity. And when we're talking about importance for humanity, we're jumping a scale. Usually when we think about economic development in the Amazon in Brazil, we're always thinking about development in itself for Brazil. But we do see that the importance of the Amazon for humanity in many areas: health, climate change, social security, populations, traditional populations. And any policy we build, we cannot leave anyone behind, as that good phrase of the UN phrase. We cannot leave anyone behind. We should not think about a sustainable development where we leave significant parts of the population behind. The Amazonas state, which is different from Amazonia. So the Amazonas state has a very complex, vulnerable population. Yeah. At the same time, we have poverty in the most conceptual terms. So we have metropolitan poverty, we have urban poverty. We also have different ethnic groups with different times of contact. We also have different interactions with the urban network, with different vulnerabilities that they should be treated differently, and they cannot be left behind. There's also an important vulnerability and poverty in the Amazon, which is related, especially in Amazonas and Roraima state, which is related to international migrations. So Amazonas state has become an important entrance of international migrants for the last already almost 10 years. So we started having the Haitians coming in through the frontier with Peru, Colombia. We do have now a significant number of people, Venezuelans, coming in from Roraima, from the north. And that gives another perspective of what is not to leave anyone behind, because it's a different population with different perspectives, but they're here and they should be considered. And also when we say not leave anyone behind, we are saying that the distance is not only a physical distance, because usually everybody thinks about the Amazon on its isolation and its different isolated peoples. It's true, we do have probably one of the last places in the world where we have groups with very, very little contact, and that needs a different structuring of politics for that. But it's also, it's not only a distance in terms of time of travel, because if everybody noticed what happened to Amazonas states during this pandemic, the COVID pandemics, the virus ran very quickly to very, 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 very far away places. And what we've been saying for a long time, you know, the urban networks and the peoples and the fluxes of peoples inside the forest, they are very, very active. So if you look at the forest from above, you might see it all green, but from below the forest, there's an intense mobility. And that's very important, because any type of structuring of policies, we cannot fall into the discourse of isolation. We do need to improve infrastructure, not only infrastructure in terms of roads, which usually people think, but in my opinion, roads are archaic in terms of what we need to include people in the modern development and the sustainable development. We do need very much to improve connectivity. in terms of digital telecommunications, and especially now that we can see everything is online, how can you work with a state where basically not only you don't have internet, sometimes you don't have telephone, so sometimes you just work on the radios. So this type of understanding of what we're talking about is very important. That's a principle. The second principle is that science and technology for the future is absolutely important in terms of any type of economic development, and what type of science and what type of technology. Very much what we've been talking about is the science and technology which has a social role. That's very important. Sometimes we only think that we need just like high science. We do need high science, no one's saying that, but we do need a science which will talk to the vulnerabilities of the people. And we do need a science which will act in society. It already happens. Amazonas State has a very interesting ecosystem of science and technology. We have in the territory, in the interiors, many public universities and schools. So if we look at the frontier, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, we have 50 PhDs, we have 180 masters, professors in two federal institutions and one state institution. So we have a possibility of working with these people and structuring the science from inside. And what science also, not only a social understanding of the role of science, but also understanding that the science still needs to know nature. We have not finished understanding how nature works. So we do need basic science. We do need applied science, of course, but we do need basic science. And that's very important. So that might be the second principle. The third principle, which talks a lot with what I started talking, is that any drawing of a public policy, we must take into account the diminishing of social and territorial inequalities. Some of these don't look directly related to the environment, but they are very much. So you can get data on, for example, pregnancies in young girls. That isn't directly linked to climate change, but it is linked to social questions, and it is very important. And so we do need to think about that. And the two last and very important points where we should think about building and structuring public policies. First, any economic development and sustainable development must have as its principle a conservation of the biodiversity. Yeah. I think if we have that as a cutting point, it will help us define what is correct and what is not correct in terms of understanding economic development. And the fourth principle, which for me is very important, we have to think the same way as other economic activities, especially the agro cattle areas, of expansion. So we do have to think more and more about the expansion of native forests, biodiverse native forests, and their role in the uses of wood, and their role in the ecosystems, and the role of expansion of forests in climate change and land use transformation. It's easy to say, but not easy to do. This might be a very good example. So if we're thinking of turning already deforested areas into forested areas, we have one very big problem. We don't have saplings. So we don't have enough trees to plant if we're going to think about native and diverse and biodiverse trees. So we do need to invest in I don't know how you call it in English, but it's like these areas, these certified areas where you can grow the saplings, where these can be used for reforestation. We do have to train people to work with deforestations. And we do need to understand that the role of science and technology in this process is unique. So if I'm thinking about the distribution of these science and technology institutions in the territory, I have to think of them as the principal articulators of reforestation. And how can we fortify their actions into producing good saplings, quality saplings of native trees? I need a lot of science. We know how to plant eucalyptus, pinus, but we don't know the diversity, I always say the social geodiversity of the forest. Why geodiversity? Acai, which everybody talks about, the acai berry. We have two different types of acai. Pará has a type of acai. Amazonas have another type of acai. They have different qualities. And in Amazonas, I don't know about Pará, and in Amazonas, every 150 kilometers, we have a different lineage of acai. That's science. And if we're thinking about future, if we're thinking about how we can structure sustainable development for the future, we have to consider that. We can't just get all acai berries, put it in a little bag and sell it as acai, because we're losing opportunities. So we need more science. We need to understand more the forest. We need to understand more the trees with a very close construction with economic development. This is one point. The second point, which is important when we're talking about sustainable development in the Amazon, is that we have a window of opportunity, which is the industrial pole of Manaus. Manaus is an industrialized city since 1967, so it's like more than 53 years of industrialization. When the project of the industrial pole of Manaus was built, no one would believe we would have big enterprises in the middle of the forest. They're here and they're working. There's a problem because they don't talk to the forest. So we have the Amazonian biome and the industrial policy, which don't talk. So we need to get them to talk. So that's a very, very challenging moment. So we need to think about an industrial policy which talks to the forest. And why do I call it a window of opportunity? We are the only state in the Amazonia which has a consolidated industrial pole. Not only in Amazonia, Brazil, Pan-Amazonia, probably if you look around in all tropical forests, we're the only place where we have a consolidated ecosystem, industrial consolidated ecosystem, but doesn't talk to the forest. How can it talk to the forest? We've been thinking about 3 different ways it can talk to the forest. The first, which is obvious to everyone, is bioeconomy. And everyone talks about bioeconomy and nobody really knows what they're talking about. So with the Concertação for the Amazonia, we built a paper, which is in a magazine. It's also translated into English. It's Página 22. It's a paper, it's a framework on bioeconomy. This framework, we create a very operational concept of bioeconomy. It's an operational concept because it's what is happening now on the ground, and it is operational because us in the public policy can use it very quickly. Basically, what it is 3 different scales of bioeconomy. The first is this traditional social biodiverse bioeconomy, which is very much related to the value chains and the forest population, indigenous and riverine population. It has a different logic. It's not totally inserted into the market. I don't know if it has to be inserted into the market. That's another question. And how can we protect these vulnerabilities and these people? The second scale is what we're called floristal bioeconomy, which is related very much to the SAF, the agro-system, floristal system, which already happens in the Amazon. It's very much a logic of the 20th century, not the 21st. But it is bioeconomy and it is functioning in the forest. And the third is what we're calling the bioeconomy of commodities. I started saying that we have to bring people into the dialogue. This is a way we're going to bring the agro-cattle people into the dialogue. You know, they are there. So how can we transform their economic activity into a more sustainable activity with more synergies with the other bioeconomy scales? Because we do believe it's possible. So bioeconomy, for sure, it's something we have to work on, and it's a possibility, but it's not the only possibility. The second possibility of making these 2 ecosystems, the forest and the industrial ecosystems talk, is with creative economy. You know, This is a very, very important. Manaus and Amazonas is the third place where we have more requests for scenographies in Brazil. São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Amazonas. We have a very big audiovisual area, tourism, ecotourism, and so and festivals and music and culture and different languages and different foods and so this is also a very important possible development between these two policies. And the third is what we call BioTIC, which is the biotechnology of information and communication. As our industrial pole already works a lot with TIC, with the technology of information and communication, we're very well structured in terms of producing softwares. We export brains of people thinking of building softwares, building hardware, Samsung, etc., etc. The university, the Federal University of Amazonas is very strong in science, computational sciences. And so we have this ecosystem which has to talk to this new bioeconomy, these new perspectives of forest, a lot of innovation and technology into the processes. So thinking about the structure and having this narrative drawn and being very sure of the premises, we start acting, we start building public policies in this respect. I'm just going to give two examples and I'll finish. The first example, we are building in partnership with the Ministry of Regional Development of Brazil, the science park. It's called Parque Científico e Tecnológico dos Saberes da Floresta, which is scientific and technological park and knowledges of the forest in the region of Alto Solimões, which is the high Solimões region in the frontier Brazil, Peru, Colombia, where I'm saying I have 50 PhDs there. And the idea is to structure a scientific park there where we can think the problems of the forest from the forest. One, two, very important, we have to impact the next generation. We are not hearing what the young people want. We're not helping the young people build their future. So as these universities has a very strong undergraduate courses, we're thinking of helping them sort out incubators, startups. It's the whole proposal is very innovative, especially for Brazil, because usually you look at these regions as faraway regions where there's nothing, and we're doing a significant investment there. The second project we have in my secretary is what we call Inova Sociobio, which is innovation in the socio-biodiversity value chains. This is a partnership with MAPA, with the Ministry of Agriculture and Pecuária and Cattle in Brazil. And this initiative comes from the premise that we have an asymmetry of information in the forest. So we hear a lot of, the thing is like, I'm going to do a good market proposal for a product. And you say, well, you have to look behind, We're not structured. We don't know how price is formed. We don't know the volume of the forest products. We have an asymmetry of information, which has to be solved. So this is how can we think about reducing the asymmetry of informations in the social biodiversity value chains? How can we impact these value chains in terms of introducing small innovations along the chain, which will help people give their first step? Because we can't start, that there's the saying that a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. We have to give the single step. And sometimes the single step is very single. It's very simple. It's like governance or accountability, helping the people organize their infrastructure. So we're thinking about how we can help these. With this, I hope I have started a dialogue with you about how can we build a narrative, and it's very important. I think for all of us in the world, it's a moment where we should restructure our narratives and understand what's happening. And from this narrative, how we act, implementing public policies in areas which aren't so obvious. So thank you very much, Anya.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Secretario Mauro de Almeida.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. Anya, I'd like to thank for the invitation and introduce me. I'm Mauro O. de Almeida, not de Almeida. I'm State Secretary of Environment and Sustainability of Pará. My occupation, my principal occupation is the State Attorney for Brazil, from Federal Attorney, General Attorney from Brazil. My colleague Tatiana Shore will help me to talk about to you, because my English is so very small in these times. But or if you prefer, and I can talk in Portuguese, and you record the register in the and translate it or subtitle after this event, ok? Então, eu vou falar um pouquinho sobre o desmatamento no Brasil e no Pará, em específico na Amazônia, no Pará específico, e o que a gente pode fazer para diminuí-lo, e tendo em vista essa reunião do presidente Biden, marcada para o dia 22 de abril agora, para tratar sobre clima, que eu reputo uma iniciativa das mais importantes dos últimos anos, e chamando, inclusive, os países que têm importância nessa questão climática atual, para a gente discutir um pouquinho com vocês. Eu acho que, para a gente entender o desmatamento no Brasil e na Amazônia, a gente tem que entender o processo histórico em que ele aconteceu. O desmatamento no Brasil, até a década de 50 do século passado, ele não era tão importante, né? Havia um grande maciço florestal no Brasil e as questões climáticas ainda não tinham aparecido, a escala de destruição que a gente infligiu ao mundo e não era tão importante como agora nos tempos atuais. Então, no Brasil, acontece uma virada de ocupação, né, pelos idos de 1950, com o estabelecimento de grandes projetos de infraestrutura básica ainda. Na verdade, os projetos que mais impactaram e ainda impactam para os fins do desmatamento até hoje são as estradas. A abertura da Belém-Brasília, né, o que rasgou o norte, ligando o centro-oeste e, por sua vez, ligando o Brasil chamado mais desenvolvido, apesar de que a Amazônia teve seu período no início do século passado, uma espécie de boom econômico, diferente deste boom, de um boom de commodities da atualidade, com a borracha, né? Então, o ciclo chamado ciclo da borracha, no início do século passado, final do século XIX, início do século XX, estabeleceu um boom econômico na região, em que atrativamente se deu o aumento de qualidade de vida nas cidades, por exemplo, como Belém e Manaus, no início do século passado. Porém, essa mudança de chave com o estabelecimento de estradas ou a abertura de estradas, em que o princípio de tudo foi a Belém-Brasília na década de 50, vai aumentando a ocupação da Amazônia, faz com que se aumente a ocupação da Amazônia e até das cidades, uma cidade como Belém, por exemplo, que era um hub de atratividade portuária, ela era um grande polo difusor de bens e serviços e a economia também, né? E com o estabelecimento da Belém-Brasília, então, se há um aumento da ocupação da Amazônia, se inicia, que se completa ou se solidifica com as aberturas das estradas da Transamazônica e da BR-163, a chamada Santarém-Cuiabá, lá pela década de 70 do século passado. São estradas, inclusive, que não se completaram o ciclo de finalização, elas ainda estão por ser asfaltadas, elas não completaram seu ciclo de finalização, mas isso foi determinante, combinado com alguns projetos de oferecimento de áreas para quem quisesse vir produzir na Amazônia, sem, muitas vezes, tentando reproduzir, ou, dito de outra forma, tentando reproduzir um processo de ocupação econômica do sul e sudeste do país na Amazônia, cujo clima, cujas características eram completamente diferentes para esse tipo de coisa, sobretudo da pecuária e da agricultura. Quando aqui chegaram esses colonos, digamos assim, eles logo encontraram essa dificuldade, pragas na agricultura, a pecuária tinha muita dificuldade de desmatar, por conta que ainda não tinham técnicas como as de hoje, técnicas que não são muito avançadas, diga-se de passagem, mas elas são eficientes, né, para alcançar o desmatamento. Mas aí a ocupação se deu e explodiu. Então, aquilo que era chamado inferno verde, ou da Amazônia, em que valia mais a terra chamada nua, ou seja, a terra desmatada, do que a floresta em pé, consolidou um processo histórico de desmatamento, com todas as consequências sociais e econômicas advindas disso. Fora isso, se implantou projetos como grandes projetos de mineração e grandes projetos hidrelétricos. Se eles não foram importantes do ponto de vista do desmatamento, eles foram do ponto de vista da ocupação, e aí as pessoas que vinham trabalhar na construção desses grandes projetos hidrelétricos e de mineração acabavam por ficar, depois de finalizada a construção desses empreendimentos, acabavam por ficar na região sem emprego e aí buscavam outras alternativas, normalmente com baixa capacidade de ganho salarial e muitas vezes vinculada a ilegalidades como o desmatamento e o garimpo ilegal. Dessa forma, nós ultrapassamos as décadas de 80 e 90, sobretudo, com altos índices de desmatamento, né? Foi na década de 90 do século passado, em que nós experimentamos, na década de 90 e depois lá em 2002, 2003, nós experimentamos os maiores índices de desmatamento na Amazônia, em que foram, então, o que acabou por repercutir e ter uma reação governamental na década de 90, com a mudança do Código Florestal, estabelecendo como as áreas de reserva legal, ou seja, aquilo que cada proprietário podia utilizar, um aumento dessa reserva legal para 80% em determinadas regiões da Amazônia, ou seja, aquele proprietário só poderia utilizar da sua propriedade em até 20%. Né? E depois, em 2003, a partir de 2003, um grande processo de criação de unidades de conservação e terras indígenas que criou um arco de proteção, seja de unidade de conservação, seja de terras indígenas na Amazônia, e também isso também se reflete no Pará com a criação de unidades de conservação, inclusive com unidades de conservação estadual. E aí nós chegamos aos tempos atuais, com esse caldo de cultura, todos vinculados, ainda hoje, a grande opção da população é a agricultura e a pecuária. Né? O extrativismo, daquelas coisas que a Tatiana falou, o açaí, aqui também o cacau, tem outras frutas típicas da região, como o bacuri, o cupuaçu, né? Ainda não ganham escala que façam com que a população deixe de praticar ou deixe de aderir a esse tipo de atividade como pecuária e agricultura e se transmute, e a própria mineração, e se transmute para um outro tipo de atividade econômica que seria mais sustentável ou até aquilo que nós chamamos hoje em dia de bioeconomia. Não é? E isso faz com que a gente tenha uma dificuldade inicial de nós precisamos mudar a cultura dessa população. Né? E mais do que isso, nós também temos, do ponto de vista da institucionalidade dos municípios, uma figura municipal que aí nos Estados Unidos poderiam ser considerados com os counties, né? Os municipalities. Né? Nós temos essa dificuldade que os prefeitos municipais, normalmente, eles estão atrelados a essa atividade econômica que é dominante na região, ou seja, o garimpo, a pecuária, a agricultura. E então eles trabalham do ponto de vista da institucionalidade a favor desse tipo de atividade econômica e não a favor de uma atividade econômica mais sustentável. Esse é o primeiro aspecto. O segundo aspecto é que, como eu disse, esse ciclo de montagem de infraestrutura logística da Amazônia não se completou ou foi interrompido em dado momento. Por exemplo, as ferrovias que já existiam na década de 50, na década de 60 e 70, elas tiveram um desprezo por parte do governo central de não ampliação da malha ferroviária e que hoje, a partir da década de 2000 do século passado, deste século já, se tentou uma retomada da construção de ferrovias e até de hidrovias, o que seria natural para o aspecto da Amazônia, tendo em vista a larga margem de rios que a Amazônia tem, né? Porém, nós privilegiamos as estradas, que é talvez a pior dos modais, o mais caro modal que a gente poderia ter investido na Amazônia, e isso fez que, além de ser um modal mais caro, se tornasse também um modal que empurra o desmatamento, ou aumenta o desmatamento, ou incentiva o desmatamento na Amazônia, em especial no Pará. Agora, então, nós tivemos tentando completar esse ciclo de logística, que é importante, inclusive, para a abertura de mercado da bioeconomia. A gente não consegue também dar escala para essa atividade econômica mais sustentável, porque nós não temos escoamento, a gente não consegue fazer um mercado interno. Hoje, você compra, por exemplo, um chocolate da Amazônia bem caro nos grandes centros, e até nos Estados Unidos, em Paris ou em Londres, mas você não encontra esse chocolate, que hoje é muito caro, no mercado ou num supermercado de Belém ou de Manaus. Você vai encontrar Nutella, você vai encontrar os Cheetos, você vai encontrar a Pringles, mas você não vai encontrar o que seria comida de verdade, aquilo que a gente chama de comida de verdade, comida saudável, que é a comida da Amazônia, as nossas sementes, o baru, a castanha do Pará, né? E outros tipos de sementes, nossos chás, que são medicinais, as nossas folhas, que servem para quase todo tipo de doença. Nós não encontramos isso nos mainstreams, né, dos supermercados locais e regionais da Amazônia. Nós encontramos isso nas feiras, com baixa escala de produtividade e baixa escala de consumo até hoje em dia. Hoje em dia, o paraense, o amazônico, de maneira geral, ele privilegia o remédio, né, alopático, do que nos nossos antepassados, que privilegiavam os remédios, a copaíba, o andiroba, que eram grandes analgésicos e curadores, né, cicatrizantes. Hoje, eles são mais desprezados do que a alopatia convencional, o mainstream da farmacêutica. Então, qual é o nosso desafio na Amazônia? Casar as duas coisas. Nós estruturamos aqui no Pará o que a gente chama de Plano Estadual Amazônia Agora, que é um plano baseado em 4 pilares, que tem a Força Estadual de Combate ao Desmatamento, que é a fiscalização e a repressão aos crimes ambientais propriamente ditos. O Programa Territórios Sustentáveis, que é um programa de incentivo às cadeias produtivas vocacionadas da Amazônia, como o açaí e o cacau, com abertura de crédito, incentivo à eficiência e outros elementos que podem atrair, né, a criação de mercados, combinado com outras secretarias, a logística para escoamento desse mercado, tudo está dentro do território sustentável. O terceiro pilar é o Fundo Amazônia Oriental, um fundo que pretende abrigar doações de estados, de instituições, de empresas, numa espécie de substituição àquele chamado Fundo Amazônia, que era o grande receptor de doações da Noruega, da Alemanha, do Reino Unido, de outros países que pudessem poder doar. Então, esse fundo pretende ser um instrumento de sustentação financeira para a implementação de políticas públicas. O quarto e último pilar do Amazônia Agora é a regularização fundiária e ambiental, que nós reputamos como imprescindível para sairmos dessa lógica do desmatamento. Então, combater o desmatamento não é só questão de recurso, como tem sido dito por aí, não é me dar um dinheiro aí que eu diminuo o desmatamento, tem que ser uma estratégia de desenvolvimento regional, de desenvolvimento para a população, sobretudo sair da ilegalidade, ela sim também sair da ilegalidade. Dou um exemplo. O estado do Pará tem um município com o maior número de cabeças de gado do Brasil, que é São Félix do Xingu. 2.800.000 cabeças de gado há naquele município de pouco mais de 100.000 habitantes. E circula muito dinheiro de exportação desse gado. Porém, esse grande recurso financeiro que circula não se reflete na vida da população. A cidade é muito ruim, ela tem um dos mais baixos índices de desenvolvimento humano do estado do Pará e, por consequência, do Brasil, e isso não se reflete no bem-estar da população. Ou a gente muda a vida da população, o bem-estar da população, a gente atribui justiça social, não sei se isso é social justice em inglês, ou a gente atribui isso à nossa população, a gente distribui verdadeiramente renda e riqueza, ou a gente não vai conseguir virar a chave do desmatamento. Nós sabemos como fazer isso, nós sabemos como diminuir o desmatamento, a gente sabe que o comando, a fiscalização e a repressão, elas são eficientes, mas elas não se mantêm no tempo. E está aí o histórico, desde 90 da década do século passado, a confirmar isso. Ele não consegue se manter porque a gente precisa de muito recurso para manter uma fiscalização, a gente precisa de bases capilarizadas nos municípios e a gente não consegue manter isso por muito tempo. Nós precisamos, então, virar a chave econômica, e isso que a Tatiana falou, com inovação, na bioeconomia, criando os mercados, estabelecendo logística para que esse escoamento da atividade, mas, sobretudo, fazendo com que a população da Amazônia, que hoje recebe cultura global, possa entender que a bioeconomia e a nossa alimentação é mais saudável do que boa parte do mundo experimenta. Então, quando a gente conseguir comunicar isso, nós precisamos de um grande plano de comunicação do que está acontecendo e o que é possível fazer para que a gente possa mudar a chave cultural. Isso é uma questão cultural, na minha opinião, também, que a gente possa mudar na Amazônia e no Pará, em específico. Não sei se falei demais, mas assim, espero que boa parte tenha entendido o que eu falei, mas fica o registro para que vocês gravem depois e traduzam e coloquem legendas daquilo que eu falei. Eu agradeço mais uma vez o Wilson Center por ter esse convite e espero colaborar em outras oportunidades, dessa vez com o apoio da tradução ou melhorando o meu inglês na próxima vez que estiver com vocês. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, secretário Mauro. Já recebemos algumas perguntas do público. We've received some questions already from the public, so I'm going to dive into those. For those of you watching, you can tweet us questions at BrazilInst or email us at brazil@wilsoncenter.org. Dr. Tatiana, the first question is for you, and this comes from Simone Atheld. I hope I'm saying that correctly, an associate professor at Florida International University. And she asks, how might we reconcile cattle and soy production with an economy of the forest? And Mauro, for you, ela perguntou qual a sua avaliação sobre a presente estagnação do Fundo Clima e Fundo Amazônia e como reativá-los no contexto do atual governo.
Aí, Maura. Well, it's very, Simone, good question. When we're thinking about the bioeconomy of commodities and how we can think about synergies, I was very much thinking about what's happening with the cheese production in France, that they're giving flowers for the cows so that they can have a better milk and then have this special cheese. Maybe we can think about cattle, a more intensive technological cattle rearing, right? Which will eat or which will dialogue with the forest as its neighbor, right? Or in it. For example, if we start feeding the cattle forested extractivist products, or if we think about circular bioeconomy for alimentary systems, which FAO has been working a lot on, and thinking about the ways we can feed cattle and at the same time structure the forest economy, that could be very interesting. I think that we have some examples of that working in Brazil, in the Pará state. But I think that is something we should dig more inside and think about more introduction and innovation. About soya beans, what I've been saying to the public policies of soya, that maybe, soya is very interesting, but soya can be planted anywhere. You can plant soya in the US, in Argentina. So maybe if we start building a moment of transition from soil to more intensive value chains from the forest, which take time to grow. So I was talking about reforestation. So if I plant the trees now, they'll take me, if I plant Brazil nut tree now and make a forest for Brazil nut, that will take me like 10, 15 years. So I need the soya bean because that's the short term for the producer. The Secretary Mauro said very well, there's those that are in the power of the municipalities have the logic of an economic development, which is very much seated on what we see in the Amazon today, like a very, very low technological cattle growing, or even soya. So maybe we have to bring these people into the dialogue of how to maintain the economic activity with the expansion of forested areas and with attraction of more value into their products, maintaining the forest and its people. I think that's what we were thinking when we started talking about this bioeconomy of commodities in the forest. Anya.
Thank you. Secretary Mauro, a question about the Climate Fund and the Amazon Fund and what the future of those are.
Bem, primeiro, eu até nem gostaria de comentar isso, porque é uma coisa que é muito doída. Eu fui chefe da consultoria jurídica do Ministério do Meio Ambiente por 5 anos, né? E participei de algumas questões muito importantes naquele momento, que foi o novo Código Florestal, a Lei Complementar 140, que depois vocês podem se interessar em pesquisar, que foi a lei que determinou quem iria licenciar o quê, se o Estado, se o município, se a União, quem iria fiscalizar o quê, depois a nova lei de biodiversidade, tudo isso eu estava lá presente e ajudei a contribuir a se estruturar. E o Fundo Clima e o Fundo Amazônia em especial, teve uma pequena mudança que ocorreu lá também, que foi incluída no Fundo Amazônia, a regularização fundiária, que não estava prevista nos eixos de atuação deles, né? E o Fundo Clima também já começava a rodar com algum financiamento, etc. E o que eu posso fazer nesse momento é lamentar que nós tenhamos hoje 700 milhões de reais ainda em carteira lá no Fundo Amazônia e que esteja estagnado por conta de um não entendimento entre o Brasil e os doadores em relação à destinação destes recursos. Também, de outra parte, nós tivemos a extinção, né, praticamente do Conselho do Fundo Clima, que não era um conselho previsto, era um conselho previsto em lei, mas acabou sendo extinto e na verdade, transformado em uma coisa muito menor, mais chapa branca, como a gente chama aqui no Brasil, sem a participação da sociedade civil, e ele também está meio paralisado. A gente lamenta também porque, nesse momento em que, por exemplo, há uma reunião como essa do presidente Biden, nós sabemos, nós entendemos e temos consciência de que, do ponto de vista formal, jurídico, quem representa o Brasil perante a comunidade internacional é o governo federal. Mas há uma dissociação entre a união que, por exemplo, os estados da Amazônia estão tendo em relação a receber as ajudas e contribuições que os países podem nos dar nesse momento e uma certa dificuldade de diálogo entre o governo federal e a comunidade internacional do ponto de vista do que se entende melhor em relação ao combate ao desmatamento, à bioeconomia e outros temas, o clima, né? A ciência e outros temas tão importantes na discussão contemporânea. Então, eu acho que isso só vai... Eu tenho consciência para mim que esse debate sobre as mudanças climáticas que já não vai sair mais de pauta, ele é permanente para hoje e para sempre, e só uma grande conscientização global, com uma pressão, inclusive, global, para que haja uma conscientização daqueles que ainda não se conscientizam disso, seja do ponto de vista governamental, seja do ponto de vista da sociedade civil, para haver uma mudança de postura nesse momento. Ania.
Thank you. We have another question from our former director, Paulo Sotero, who's currently a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center. And his question is similar in a way, but he notes that there seems to be increasing pressure from subnational actors in Brazil, from governors, from private sector companies, from civil society, for the adoption of concrete measures to address deforestation. And so he asks, you know, how does this look on the ground? And how should the Biden government and the international community be looking, who should they be looking to for partners when it comes to sustainable development and deforestation in the Amazon?
Tatiana?
Okay, well, it's a good question, because we're now starting to think and act differently than we had in the past decade, especially because the federal government has a distinct posture, and that posture is not necessarily aligned to the all understanding of what are the important actions in terms of climate change and how to deal with a dialogue with society. What we have been trying to do, and we, especially our secretary, is everything we do, we try to work in the fifth Alice perspective. So any debate we're in, or any participation or any dialogue we construct, we think about bringing always civil society and the third sector. Especially when we say about civil society, we try to bring the population, like organized population, extractivism, associativism. It's not easy. People are not accustomed to talk, especially in this virtual world. So, but it has to be built on. And then the academia, I think it's very important. We as academics may have a very important role, because when we're academic, we can say directly what we think, you know, and that is important when the dialogue is a bit rusty and truncado, as we say in Portuguese. Also bring the private sector, not only the big guys, but also the smaller figures in the public sector, especially local public sector, especially, and this is something I've been trying to do a lot, is the new generation of the public sector, the young entrepreneurs. This is important. And the different spheres of governance, the different spheres of government, the federal and the state government. There's an expression that was a lot used in this last administration, the Trump administration, was the deep state. So in Brazil, the deep state has a very important role. We have a very good deep state, very well qualified and very serious. And so the deep state is important to bring them forward. And also we have to think about the investment banks, which are the people, or the investors in general, the people with money. Yeah. And when we put all these together to talk, we start to understand, you know, what is happening on the ground, and where the different perspectives of everything can act in a consensus. So that's why I started with this dialogue about the narrative. We have to get our narrative right. We have to know what we want and what are our principles. If we know what are our principles, we can reorganize ourselves in terms of collaboration. It can be a subnational collaboration, state and municipalities. It can be direct collaboration, business to business. It can be collaboration, international cooperation with states, with civil society and organization of civil society. So there must be a moment of patience in the dialogue. You know, and I think that's what we're most missing, and maybe that can build us some interesting bridges. And Mauro said also something very important is we do have an economic problem, yeah, and it's growing with the pandemic. So if we don't look at it as an economic problem And if we don't take some decisions in the short and medium term, everything we say might just go, might just go down, because the reality is that it's easier to just do what you're accustomed to doing. It's very uncomfortable to start doing something new where you're in a very economic crisis. So it's a situation where things have to be built in together. So dialogue is very important, and with all, not only with one sector, with all. Mauro.
Como eu falei ainda há pouco, nós temos um problema de comunicação. Quando eu falo comunicação, de uma maneira geral, a população dessas cidades que eu comentei ainda agora, as cidades que mais desmatam no Pará, por exemplo, eles entendem que a alternativa de emprego para eles é a pecuária, a mineração e o desmatamento, a derrubada da floresta. Tá? Então, do ponto de vista por isso que eu falei que era uma questão cultural também, mas do ponto de vista, nós precisamos fazer com que eles não só entendam isso, mas eles também têm que sentir isso. Então, quando eu falo que a gente tem que fazer justiça social, a gente não resolve o problema do desmatamento apenas com repressão. Isso qualquer governo de qualquer bandeira vai dizer isso, tá? A questão é como eu faço essa virada de chave. Alguns governos vão dizer assim: não, a alternativa continua sendo a pecuária, continua sendo a agricultura e continua sendo o desmatamento. Continua sendo o garimpo, continua sendo a mineração. Ok. O outro diz assim: não, nós precisamos fazer isso que a Tatiana falou, uma pecuária intensiva, mais eficiente, uma agricultura com serviços agroflorestais, né, um manejo florestal cada vez mais abrangente. Então, aí a forma com que você vai transformando isso é que vai determinar se nós vamos ser um país em desenvolvimento sustentável ou um país em desenvolvimento destrutível. Por enquanto, nós somos esse segundo país aí, e a nossa população do Brasil profundo, que a Tatiana chamou de Deep State, eu chamo de Brasil profundo, né, aqui em português, a população do Brasil profundo está alinhada com esse outro Brasil. Tá? E a gente precisa entender isso, e o mundo precisa entender isso. Tá? Esse mundo globalizado, com consciência climática, com consciência de que a Terra está sendo destruída, no Brasil profundo, não é esse mundo, tá? A comunicação não chega desse jeito lá. E a gente precisa, então, transformar isso. Se a gente conseguir fazer combinado, né, uma transformação a partir da bioeconomia, como eu disse, criação de mercados, etc., nós vamos chegar num bom caminho. Se a gente não conseguir comunicar isso, e nós não estamos comunicando isso bem, porque as iniciativas dos estados têm sido isoladas, os estados, para puxar um fio que você está demandando, os estados não têm problema com pressão, na verdade, eles não se sentem pressionados pela mudança climática. Os estados da Amazônia, que eu quero dizer, eles se uniram num consórcio de estados da Amazônia Legal para criar um fundo, né, próprio. Eles já têm condições de receber recursos de doação e de investimentos no chamado Fumbio, que é o órgão ou a entidade executora desse fundo, né? E tem estruturado políticas para que recepcione a ajuda daqueles que querem ajudar. Portanto, os estados subnacionais não se sentem pressionados, muito pelo contrário, eles estão abertos a recepcionar qualquer ajuda que seja. A questão toda é que entre os estados subnacionais e a comunidade internacional tem um outro estado que é o que nos representa na comunidade internacional. Então, esse nós temos que ajustar, eles têm que entender, eles têm que se conscientizar, e isso só é feito pela arte da política, né? Por a arte da política mundial que se apresenta aí, tá bem? Eu não vou, Ania, eu queria só dizer que eu não vou conseguir ficar até o final, tá? O governador está me chamando, e eu vou ter que me retirar. Eu não sei se a Tatiana prossegue aí com vocês, mas eu vou ter que verdadeiramente me retirar, tá bem? Eu agradeço mais uma vez o empenho de vocês no convite. Me desculpem mais uma vez por não ter falado na língua natural aí do Woodrow Wilson Center, mas estou à disposição. Espero participar de outros debates com vocês aqui no Wilson Center, tá bem?
Obrigada,
Muito
foi um
obrigado.
grande prazer tê-lo conosco hoje.
Tá bem. Tatiana, até mais ver, minha colega e vizinha. Tchau, tchau.
Ciao. So Mauro was unfortunately called away by the governor, pressing duties. But Tatiana, I wonder if I could ask you one last question, and then maybe we'll wrap up. There seems to be almost a tension between the long-term needs, right, which are changing the economic incentives, creating these different development pathways that are focused on sustainability, bioeconomy, and kind of the short-term demands that many people are facing of putting food on the table, trying to figure out how to generate economic resources, right, which is driving some of the illicit activities that we're seeing. So how do you balance the long-term plans of moving towards more sustainable development with the shorter term needs for monitoring and enforcement?
Well, to start, I would say in terms of the short-term necessities, we talk a lot about valorizing, giving value to forest products, but when you're paid for them here, they're very badly paid. So people don't feel really, many of them don't feel that maintaining the forest and maintaining the bioeconomy is in fact giving them some breathing space in the short term. Not everybody. I think there are some very, very interesting experiments, some very interesting cases which impact a lot the people. There's one specifically in the Juruá, which is a river, around the Association of Collective Rural Producers. And with them is the management, the community management of pirarucu, which is this big fish. And this has been going on for the last 10 years. And it's very interesting because at the same time, it has become a very important monetary revenue for the families. And it is also impacting the conservation of lakes and all the biodiversity of the water biodiversity. But these fishermen still earn very little. So they're paid around less than $1 the kilo of this marvelous fish, and it's a natural fish. It's like the Alaskan salmon. So this is something we should correct. There are many alternatives how to do it and how to think about it. So how can we trickle down the value chains, the real value for this, for the forest products? When we're talking about investments in the forest, we're also thinking about this taxonomy of investments. We're organizing a forum with the Concertação. It's a joint venture from the government of Amazonas and the Concertação Bioeconomy Working Group, where we're going to discuss innovation and investments in bioeconomy in the Amazon. Because we can't just think that there has been no investment. There has been lots of investment, but much hasn't worked. So we have to think about how can we innovate in the way we do our investments. And one of the discussions we're having, perhaps it's going to be very interesting. I'll send you the invitation. You can send it to your links. One of the discussions we're going to have is how can we think of a taxonomy of investments adequate to a ruler of maturity in the value chains. So what type of investment is more adequate for which timing that value chain is? How can we think about blending investment so that accordingly to how this value chain and its actors are working, we can help them jump the steps slowly, because nothing can be very quickly. And how can we think about these synergies between this commodity bioeconomy and this forest world. Sometimes they happen in the same territory, but they don't talk. They're not articulated. And how can we think about that? So if we're thinking about a green economy recovery or Green New Deal, we have to understand the different historical temporalities that coexist in the forest. And we have to think about how can we optimize these different temporalities without being destructive and without being disruptive. Because sometimes people just think, we're going to organize the market, we're going to put all these people in the market, and then you go to these people badly know how to do maths. How can I put them into a negotiation table? Or they don't want, because life is very good. When sometimes you come to places here in the Amazon, I take people traveling in the Amazon and they look at me and say, what do these people live from? And look, they don't, from what do they live? And I always answer, they live from life. So sometimes it is, but how can we help them have a big possibilities, a big construct possibility where they can choose how they can live? I think that's a question. So that's one thing. And in the long term, for sure, for me, it's more and more critical. I know it's a discussion people don't like because everybody all the time talk about, we do have to invest in education. There's no solution if we don't, in fact, put a good education from the base, from kindergarten onwards to university in the Amazon. That's one. And the other thing, we also have to educate the world to look at the Amazon. So I need to think about how do I construct from inside the Amazon a very strong educational base. And I also have to educate the world to think about what is the Amazon. Because what we feel much more is that people look at the Amazon in a very idyllic or in a very, in a way which does not correspond to reality. So I think we need to do this movement, educate here and educate outside. But especially if we want to have an impact here, we do have to invest strongly in what exists in terms of science and technology here. What I was saying, like this, our science and technology ecosystem in the Amazonas state is very strong. When COVID happened, the pandemic, the researchers, they didn't run away, they stayed there. They helped the Kokama population, they helped the municipalities organize themselves, they talked to the commercials. So the role of science is much more important than people think, because usually in other places, science is like this, far away place, it's not involved. It is, I'm here, I'm a scientist, I'm doing public policy, and I'm not the only one. I have many students who are now in the municipalities. So this is something, in my opinion, if we really want to impact and stop deforestation, we have to invest in science and technology in here with the people from here. And that also means making bridges, helping them out with interesting programs. The US has the Fulbright program, which is really interesting. We could think about an Amazonian Fulbright program where we could get all of these local researchers in the universities, in the local universities, and put them, to make networks with people. That has a much bigger impact than we can imagine, because it's there we get the young people. It's in the university that we get the young people. And yeah.
I think listening to you, what I take away is that we need to think much more broadly and much more creatively about how to tackle deforestation, right? Mm-hmm. We shouldn't just be saying, how do we stop this person from cutting down a tree?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is important. That's what I say about the young people, and I'm trying to look at generational question. I think it's important. So we have, for example, in the university, we get a lot of indigenous students and local students, and that has been the best way we can trigger down new technologies. when they go back to their communities, to their villages, and they start working with their parents and their association and saying, look, I have a very good example of a person which works with me. She was the first person in her family to be in the university. She was a forest engineer, and her mother was a traditional agriculture in the Amazon. So very traditional, cut and slash, put flower, lots of insecticide and herbicides, etc. And she managed to convince her mother and all the community around her mother to be organic. So they're the most important group, one of the most important group of organic in Manaus. And it was her, the daughter, not me, not a specialist, the daughter that went through university, met a teacher who liked organic, which took her to see how organic works. She believed in that. So she organized a trip with all her family and the community to see organic plantation in São Paulo. And then they came back and they have been, so this is where change happens. I think so. We have to really look into where we're going to put all our cards.
Thank you. This has been incredibly interesting to me, and I hope to our audience as well. I'm going to wrap it up, and thank you so much, Dr. Tatiana, for joining us here today. We unfortunately had to say goodbye to Secretary Mauro earlier today, but thank you for staying with us and for, I think, really raising awareness and kind of expanding our discussion of what it means to talk about sustainable development and conservation in the Amazon.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Anya. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a good discussion. I always like to hear Mauro. I think he has a very interesting perspective. And I hope that this meeting and this new US government will be more generous and bring more dialogue together. I think the world needs more dialogue, and that's important. To talk is always important.
Yes, well, we here at the Wilson Center agree completely. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
To all of you watching, there will be a recording available on our website, and stay tuned for more events in the future.